For our first topic, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo met with Chinese officials in both Beijing and Shanghai this past week. Raimondo made an effort to cool tensions and manage the competition between the U.S. and China following recent export controls and investment bans from the Biden administration and the PRC's current economic spiral. Miles, can you tell us a bit about this trip, who she met with, and whether anything substantive came out of this visit?
Well, she is meeting the Chinese premier and some of the main interlocutors. And I think this is obviously a part of the series of cabinet-level visits of late. Commerce, however, is unique because Commerce Department is in charge of specific implementation of American trade policy. For China, the stake is high. That's because there are hundreds of Chinese companies that are currently on the entity list. They were subject to some kind of sanctions or scrutiny by the U.S. government. Commerce is mostly responsible for implementing that and verify some of the criteria upon which to engage with China economically. Commerce also obviously is the main implementer of the export control that the President Biden has announced in his recent executive order. In other words, she's a very important person from the trade and economic point of view from Chinese. That's why she's treated slightly better than her predecessor to China. And I think we saw that Secretary Blinken was pretty businesslike. There was no particular respect from Xi Jinping's point of view, and he was sat at the lower end of the table to be lectured on by the supreme leader of China. And Secretary Yellen went to China. I mean, there's no tangible result. I think the most we saw out of the news reporting is that she had a delicious dish of Chinese magic mushrooms. And John Kerry, of course, was cold-shouldered and snubbed by the Chinese government. And while they put him in the hotel eating pizza, they held a huge banquet to honor China's friend Henry Kissinger in the Great Hall of the People. And they didn't do any of that to Secretary Raimondo because, as I say, she's a person that really holds the key to some of the trade interactions with China.
So this sort of better treatment that she received, do you think this is solely due to her having different responsibilities within the U.S. government with regards to trade, or is another factor in this that the PRC's economic situation is quite dire compared to the last few visits we've seen?
Yes and no. I think, she's the first Secretary of Commerce who went to China and said specifically that dialogue in the past has been used by the Chinese government as a way to avoid confronting the real issues. In other words, dialogue was conducted for the sake of dialogue, never solve any problems. This has been a pattern. So she said, well, this is not going to be the case. China wanted her to remove tariff, for example. She said no. China wanted her to lobby her to lessen the export control. She said, no, we're going to talk about, why we're doing this. We just want to share this information with you. But the biggest accomplishment for Secretary Raimondo, I think, is something that most people have not seen. And that is, she actually subliminally changed the way of American corporate world dealing with China. That is, for the first time in many years, when American companies, when they have a problem with China, it's just like that. It's this private company's problem with China. But Secretary Raimondo said, no. I go to China. I'm going to tell the Chinese, American companies' problem are no longer just American companies' problem with China. It's America's problem with China. This has become a sovereign issue, not just a corporate issue. And this, I think, is very, very significant because this dramatically reduced the reliance of these big American corporations on those China brokers, on the business lobbyists, whose sole job is to sell access to senior Chinese leaders to corporate America. And that has been basically the issue in the past. Many American companies were mistreated by the Chinese government, but no company would like to stick its head out to be the first to be sanctioned by China. So they are very reluctant to come to the American government in Washington, D.C. for help. And this actually is a tremendous change of climate. And I think that is something that, in my view, is very significant.
So, as you've noted, this is the fourth cabinet level visit we've witnessed and spoken about on this podcast this summer. Reflecting on this trip and in conjunction with the past three from Kerry, Yellen, and Blinken, do you see throughout these trips a common thread, a common strategy of engagement from the Biden administration, or are we seeing a turn at all? And if it's the former, do you think the administration is achieving its aim?
I think this is a very important thing to deal with China. The most important thing is that we must change our entire approach to China. And in other words, the previous administration had been accused by its detractors that we did not have a China policy. We only had a China attitude. And that was totally wrong. We not only had a very solid China policy, we definitely had the China policy with the right attitude. That is a very fundamental change. That kind of a right attitude with the sound China policy have been carried over to this administration, not because of any lack of any partisan discomfort, but mostly because this is the right thing, so obvious and is so correct that it's very hard to change that. And I think that both parties were realist. And across the aisle, we do have a national consensus on that. Now, the corporate America, the China lobbyists, the China brokers are now trying to portray this approach by both Trump and the Biden administration as partisan. That is a nonsense. This is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democrat issue. It's an American issue.
For our next topic, this past Friday, China took measures to aid the country's spiraling economy. On Thursday, the People's Bank of China and the National Administration of Financial Regulation released a joint statement announcing minimum down payments for home purchases would be cut by up to 20% for first-time buyers and 30% for second-time buyers nationwide. Interest rates on new mortgages have also been slashed substantially, and existing mortgages for first-time home purchases will be given the opportunity to be renegotiated beginning September 25th. They're also taking action to prevent further devaluation of the yuan, cutting the amount of foreign currency banks are required to hold in reserve down to 4% from 6%. And the government is also putting forward measures aimed at increasing household consumption, doubling tax breaks on childcare and education, and increasing tax relief for costs associated with taking care of elderly parents. Miles, could you tell us a bit more about the stimulus efforts the PRC is putting in place? And could we get your thoughts on how effective these might be? We saw some initial optimism from analysts, although it already looks like that optimism might be waning. What's your take on the current situation?
I think it's too little too late because the current economic woes in China are caused not by change of policy, but also by its systematic institutional flaws. The problem is China tried to change a little policy here and there, try to fix the systematic problem. That's not going to work. Most fundamentally, the economic trouble in China is caused by its non-market nature of its economy. This is not a market economy. No financial institutions and no sovereign country of a free market nature have recognized China as a market economy. So that should be very important. As such, basically, it's a Chinese Communist Party dictated the economy. That is, the party center now has full control of its economic decisions and economic policies, ranging from currency manipulation to currency control, and it's a trade, and many of the policies implemented by the party is not economically based and not market based, but based upon political security and ideological grounds. So those were a very, very big problem. Now, you mentioned about the People's Bank of China change its requirement for down payment. This is also not very realistic. It's just a little bit too late and too little. That's because China's real estate market is collapsing. To use avalanche, landslide, that's not really accurate to even describe the degree to which Chinese real estate market is in big trouble. So you lower the down payment requirement and you lower the mortgage interest rate. But still, for most people, it's not really the problem. The problem is they have lost confidence in the Chinese economic system. No matter how much the government tries to do, it's still not going to be enough because people were not purchasing, not buying houses when the values of the existing inventory are dropping by 30, 40, 50, even 70%. So there's no convincing reason for anybody to say it will never bounce back because this real estate market collapse is caused by systemic problems. It's not the regular cycle of a free market system. So that's why people are still not buying houses. Now, also keep in mind, when you talk about down payment reduction, we're talking about the reduction from the existing 60 to 80% of down payment. That's very substantial. It's much bigger than the regular down payment requirement. In the United States, the regular one is 20%, right? In some cases, you can actually get away. If you have good collateral, you can get as little as 5%. So in Beijing, for example, most people would pay somewhere between 60 to 80% down payment of the cost. Now the new rate is basically reduced to about 35 to 40%. That's still very substantial. The interest rate used to be about 5.25%, but now it's reduced to something around 5%. It's not really significant enough to win back the confidence of consumers. I don't think that the huge surplus of China's housing units will be purchased by people still have to dole out a lot of money to buy that. I mean, this is, again, it's a gimmicky, and I don't think people are really buying it.
For our last topic, this past Monday, the PRC indicated that Xi Jinping will be skipping the upcoming G20 summit hosted in India. In his stead, Premier Li Qiang will attend. Miles, what do you make of this? From what I've seen, Chinese spokespersons have been rather cagey about this, and some commentators have framed this in light of border tensions between China and India. Although I wonder how that narrative can be squared with China's recent optimism about the expansion of BRICS, of which India is a member. How significant is it that Xi Jinping will miss this summit?
It's very ironic because Xi Jinping has dreamed of being a global leader. He wants to point the direction to the whole world as to which direction the world should go. And yet, this is a leader of global stature, has developed a very strong aversion to global traveling. It was not even sure that he could make it to South Africa for the BRICS meeting a couple weeks ago. And he went there, and of course, his buddy Vladimir Putin was absent because Putin was wanted by international criminal justice system. So I think that the fact that India is hosting it is actually something that displeases the Xi Jinping, because China never take India seriously. China had this kind of a very bizarre, blind obsession with anti-American alliance. And it believes that India has some kind of anti-American streak. But that's wrong. I mean, India play a very interesting role in world politics. So India is rising. India is a developing country in many aspects. India has now become the leader of the non-Western world. China is perceived to be that leader. And so China is very unhappy about that. Now, there's also some specific issues here. India and China have a really tense relationship of late in the last 3-4 years, particularly after the June 2020 Ladakh incident, during which that some 24 Indian soldiers were bludgeoned to death by the Chinese border guards. So there is a really strong animosity toward China, not only from the leadership's part. It's also the whole popular sentiment. Something around midnight, 80% of the Indian population have a negative view of China, according to a recent Pew poll. On top of that, China last week published a new territorial map that basically enraged India in particular, and virtually every other country in our region is very unhappy about China's publication of this new map. Countries like Malaysia, Borneo, the Philippines, Vietnam, and of course India, they all lodged a protest against China's publication of the new maps that include the territories that were in dispute. So this is kind of a situation where if Xi Jinping goes to India, he would have to answer this kind of awkward questions to explain why. And don't forget, Xi Jinping is also obsessed of forming an international alliance system against the United States. If you go to G20 in New Delhi, you will see majority of the G20 countries are democracies that were on the side of the United States. Those countries include Australia, Canada, France, Germany, India, Italy, Japan, South Korea, UK, US, EU, countries and the groups that were decisively on the China's opposite. Xi Jinping probably does not really have this guts to face all this music, if you will, in New Delhi.
So we've covered some tension between the PRC and India. We've covered some sensitive questions that Xi Jinping may not wish to readily confront and ideological differences between the PRC and other countries in the G20. To what degree does solidarity with Russia and tension within the G20 over the Ukraine war play a role in this decision and in China's relationship to the G20 generally? We've discussed in previous episodes both countries' desire to supplant Western-led political and economic coalitions through parallel organizations. And maybe as a follow-up, do you see generally both countries perhaps moving away from organizations like the G20, or are they still dependent on them such that we'll see engagement for some time?
That's a good question. I think Russia and China, obviously, they share something in common. That is, they're both anti-Western. They are both sort of near pariah states in this international period of time when Russia's naked aggression of Ukraine is openly embraced by China. I mean, China and Russia are notoriously together on this issue. China has never condemned Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and also Chinese state media domestically has absolutely pro-Russia in this incident. That makes China and Russia sort of on a united front. On the other hand, Russia and China have decisively different interests, particularly in Central Asia, also Russia's Far East region. And I think Russia is very cautious about China's ambition. China wants to become a global leader, and so does Vladimir Putin. So therefore, there is a clash of egos and ambitions. It is worrisome that they're getting closer and closer. Much of that is our own doing because we push Russia closer and closer to China. On the other hand, it's all based upon behavior. Russia and China, they're always in some kind of alliance, but those alliances have never worked out very well. You can see from the history of the last 70, 80 years.